I'm really happy and excited to be able to talk to you today. Actually, I was a little bit unsure about what to talk about and how to present it, how to frame it, but we spoke about it beforehand, and I think just giving an outline of some of the ideas that I'm working through in the work that I'm doing hopefully should be worthwhile and a useful thing to talk through. So 7 sociological explanations. I don't know whether I'm biting off more than I can chew here, so I'll kind of talk for about 5 minutes on each of them and see how we get on. Hopefully that should take up the right amount of time. Now, if you're anything like me, I can normally cope with about 1 or 2 new bits of information at a time, so I'm sure that not everyone's going to be interested in all 7, but my thinking was that, if I present 7, then maybe 2 or 3 might resonate with different people, and across the attendees, overall it might be something quite useful. Okay, so as a bit of a preamble, I wanted to kind of talk through what the intentions were, but also talk about sociology a little bit, just to make sure everyone's on the same page. So, as Jen explained then, so my thinking here is that there is a recent interest in using social theory to better understand why many people find it difficult to be physically active, and why this tends to be patterned across different demographic groups. So there's a recent interest. I don't know whether I'm saying a little bit too much about that, but for me, that the kind of whole systems approach, the whole systems movement, as well as the social ecological model, is all sort of moving towards a realm where I think sociology could be quite useful. And having engaged in the physical activity promotion literature for some time, I tend to think that social theory and sociological perspectives aren't used as much as they could be. I don't know whether that's the fault of sociologists or the fault of the kind of existing paradigm and the existing norms within the domain itself. So I'm going to try and do that, and I'm going to summarize some of the ideas that are in my recently published articles. Obviously, when I say my, what I mean is not just me on my own. Obviously, you'll see the co-authors and collaborators that I'm working with as well. So, of course, they need to be acknowledged, and try and see if these have some implications for policy and practice. And this is where I'm, a little bit more uncomfortable. I'm in a kind of more tentative space in terms of what this can offer, and really I'd like to kind of offer that out for discussion, and I'd love to hear what people who are delivering initiatives on the ground, like Jump, a practical real world initiative and program, whether you think these things can be applicable and useful. So to talk about sociology briefly, just to kind of set this up, there are a range of different things. I'm only going to touch on a few ideas today, but according to the British Sociological Association, what we're talking about, what I'm referring to, is the domains and aspects of human social behaviour. We're talking about social dynamics of small groups, but also large organisations, communities, institutions, and entire societies. We're talking about the interaction between groups and individuals in human society. And in my view, I like this idea of external factors. So if you want to differentiate between psychology and sociology, it might be thinking the internal and the external. Graham Scambler talks about how societies are organised and people are positioned within them. If individual behaviour is not determined, he says, and it most certainly is not, it's undoubtedly socially structured and filtered through the properties of global, national, regional and local cultures. And if this is all a little bit academic, then this one more here is a paper from Connie Gill and colleagues, and explicitly talking about using social theory in the title, which I think kind of highlights what I'm talking about and the area and direction that I'm interested in. So as I said, if this is getting a little bit too academic, I like to think of a distinction maybe between psychology and sociology in this way. So this quote that you might see sometimes, a kind of inspirational image, and this idea of dance like there's nobody watching is a way to experience kind of joy, experience expression by changing your imagination, changing your perception. Dance like nobody's watching, and you'll be able to see the world in a different way. Sociologists are probably a little bit more pessimistic, a little bit more miserable than that, I'd say, often, and probably prefer to go down the line of maybe what Alex Turner wrote in Arctic Monkeys' latest album, the line "Dance like somebody's watching, because they are." So maybe being a bit more realist than other perspectives. So that's kind of where I'm at. So what am I going to talk about? So the 7 things that I'm going to talk about are in front of you there. So I'm going to talk about social capital, social class, stigma, social practices, the Inequality Paradox, Contingency, and Transformative Change. So like I said, hopefully a couple of them will resonate for you, and someone might find them any one of them might be interesting for someone. Okay, so on social capital then, so the format I'm going to do is I'm going to talk through kind of what is it, give a basic definition really, and how I think it might help explain physical inactivity. Then I'm going to talk about how quickly I've applied it in my work, and then mention how it might be applied to practice. And this is going to be quite a kind of quick whistle-stop tour of each of these, and I've decided to kind of do that kind of superficial reading of it. So apologies for that, but I think it's good to kind of rattle through and see hopefully if any of these resonate. So what is it? So for me, if I was going to explain it in a kind of most basic sense, I think of it as resources, and the resources that you can draw on through your social network. Okay, so think about any time in your life where you've asked a friend for help, or someone else has helped you and you've helped them. What you're doing there is you're drawing on resources through your social network. This is sometimes measured at an individual level, so some individuals can have higher social capital than others, but sometimes at a community level as well. So we can talk about some communities having higher social capital than other communities. And in many studies, the question, do you trust your neighbours, is used as a kind of proxy indicator, because it sometimes gets to the heart of what we mean. If you trust someone, you're probably willing to help them, and they're willing to help you. And what we see through the social capital research is that there are large differences between demographic groups, and that's something which we can start to explore and becomes interesting. So it's also not just the size of the network, so how many people, but also the value of the resources that can be drawn on through the network. So asking a friend to help, if you have an electrician who's a friend and they can help you with a problem in your house, that's useful, and that might save you some money. But if you have a friend who is a doctor, or perhaps a lawyer, or someone who's a CEO that can kind of help give you some inside information to get you a job, the value of those resources are probably higher. So the reason why I think this is a useful explanation is that material connections between people can facilitate physical activity, and some people have more connections than others. So I'm just unsure how I suddenly lost the ability to skip the screen. Give me a moment. Okay, so how have I used this in my research? So in this, if you want to look up this paper, if you find it useful, so I've done some research on parkrun, and we use social capital to help see how that works and how that plays out in parkrun. And what we saw is that participants who go to parkrun often draw on existing social ties, so family, friends, neighbours and colleagues, to initiate their participation in parkrun. So participants invest in and benefit from the labour, all the help, all the resources that are offered by the wider parkrun community when they go there. So in a way, it's a kind of demonstration of social capital by going there and gaining from the resources that are available at parkrun. And participants utilise the acquired social capital as well, which they think is interesting, to accumulate cultural capital. So you can, through these social connections, you also learn about things like injury management, performance, and health. So in terms of policy and practice, I think social capital is a key resource in the initiation and maintenance of physical activity. So consider intervening maybe at the social capital level, not just the physical physical activity opportunities level. I think this also might mean that volunteer-led, community-based initiatives have the capacity to mobilise resource through social networks. So volunteer-led, community-based initiatives, I mean like parkrun, this might be actually useful to mobilise those connections that are sort of almost there and might be available, but actually realising them might be important. But in the context of persistent socioeconomic inequalities, so we know that some people have more, some groups have higher social capital than others, it's likely that if you just rely on social capital to promote health enhancing behaviours like physical activity, it will probably limit the success there and reproduce inequalities. Okay, so if you're only relying on social capital, the groups with higher social capital already are going to be able to capitalise on that more. Okay, so the second explanation is around social class. So it's a topic that I've used a little bit and am interested in. So hopefully a definition is probably not needed too much here. People generally have an idea what social class kind of means, but it's also worth noting that the kind of three class structure that is probably common in everyday vernacular, kind of working, middle and upper, are less relevant today as they once were perhaps. So according to a study by Mike Savage and colleagues in London School of Economics, there are now two class fractions below the traditional working class, and those who occupy the lowest class position, referred to as the precariat, experience an increasing level of things like social isolation, economic deprivation, and lack of cultural participation. So these are largely economic, of course, but it's also about social and symbolic distinctions between people. So the idea of taste is something that I've kind of brought in to my work. So the explanation here is like how does this relate to physical activity? Yes, social class is about opportunities, but it's also about other concerns. What concerns do people of different class groups have? And is taste relevant here as well? Is there a taste perhaps for less formal sport? So those of you who know how to have a good time probably have read The Economist this week and have seen that this front page image I thought kind of immediately struck me, because the main idea, the main title heading there is about levelling up, how to fix Britain's left behind areas. And the image of, kind of symbolic image of this kid scootering down the streets is something that resonated for me. It resonated for me because it's something I brought up in my PhD research, which ended up being this paper here, talking about how different pupils from different schools in different communities, some more deprived, some more middle class communities, did different things in their leisure time in terms of physical activity. When you talk about physical activity, they had a preference to do different things, and for me, I thought that resonated. It said something about social class, their choices, their decisions that they made around this. So physically active practices have class-based meanings. These might be dispositions towards physically active practices that say something about your social class. So practices that are associated with meanings about being healthy, this is what we claim in the paper, align more with some social class groups than others. So Schilling says that people make their bodies through labour, sport and play. So it is this disposition, but they're not making them in circumstances of their own choosing. So there's something about the circumstance that creates a kind of taste, and it leads to practices which are differentiated across different class groups. So of course, social class, what this means is we need to address opportunities and the fact that The Jump program is being funded in Bradford. There's a lot about this as an investment within itself. But recognising preferences, dispositions and taste is an important part of the process. We need to understand that doing an activity for health, so promoting an activity because it's healthy for you, it's good for you, might be less meaningful for lower SES groups, arguably. I think reducing social inequalities on a broader scale ultimately might be the solution to this. So if we had a more equal society, if we are successful in levelling up Britain, for example, on a broader scale, that I believe is probably going to have more impact on health disparities ultimately, rather than kind of tailoring different activities to different groups. So again, this is a kind of tentative ideas. How this has implications in the real world is still a big question mark in my own head. So stigma is another concept that is used by sociologists a lot, but it also aligns closely with shame and also individual responsibilization. So what does this mean? This means framing a social problem in individualistic terms. Okay, so if the problem is largely understood and explained by social forces, explaining them and framing it in individualistic terms is part of this stigma, shame, and individual responsibilization. So sometimes politically convenient, and it's been referred to as weaponization. Graham Scambler likes that word. So, for example, if the government currently are being accused of mishandling the COVID-19 pandemic, but then they say that the high rates of infection and death are related to obesity, and obesity is because people are kind of lazy and not putting their socks up and doing enough to look after their health, it conveniently might let them off the hook. So that might be a matter of perspective, but it has been used in these kinds of analyses. So not only is poor health bad, but it's your fault. And there's the kind of explanation, the logic model here is a little bit around the houses, but how this explains physical activity, I think that guilt and making people, kind of shaming people into physical activity might offer poor long-term motivation, and it might detract from the real causes of physical inactivity as well, which is not helpful in the longer term. So in my research, this pops up. In the same parkrun study, we kind of analysed the data in a different way, and we talked about responsibilization. But we actually, you can probably start to tell that I'm a kind of parkrun advocate. I think it's basically a good thing. So we actually use this as a bit of a good news story. So even though people are feeling this idea of individual responsibilization from society and the health discourses more broadly, we've thought that in the context of parkrun as a kind of collective practice where people are kind of volunteering, helping each other out, you're part of a big group rather than kind of exercising on your own somewhere, we think that it kind of helped share this responsibility. It became more of a collective process. So moving more for health reasons is bound up with conflicting moral imperatives about the healthy body. Redefining exercise as medicine, as we've seen over the last however many years, contributes to the conditions of possibility through which citizens govern their embodied selves as risky. So it wasn't always the case that people recognised that they were less active and that was going to have implications for their health and illness. And now that's a much more prevalent idea. And we said the parkrun offers a space for this collective body work whereby participants simultaneously enact personal body projects, so they're concerned on that individual level, but they also experience a sense of being all in this together, which works to ameliorate the individualizing effects of health responsibilization. And what this might mean, this is far from a new idea at all, and you'll probably see this a lot, but blaming people for physical inactivity on poor individual choices is not a good idea. I think it's a little bit different to talking about individual choices as solutions. So, but obviously, similarly, we need to be careful about framing how good choices is the solution. And collective practices might offer a kind of middle ground here, like parkrun, where the responsibility for how you are physically active is shared between people. Excuse me. So the fourth out of these 7 is social practices. Now, this is something I've been really interested in the last maybe 18 months or so, in a project that was led by Fiona Spotswood at UWE and now at Bristol. We've been engaging in social practice theory for a while. So this is quite interesting. So it's a kind of shift in perspective, really. So it's the view that physical activity behaviours, so think of walking, for example, we're arguably better understanding them as social practices to reflect their social nature. So by changing perspectives, what I mean is drinking tea is a common example in this when people are talking about social practice theories. Think of it as a social convention. So even though from our perspectives it is us making a cup of tea, which involves a desire to drink, but also there's a history around it. You are going to put the kettle on and putting the tea bag in and having a cup of tea and maybe having it with friends or family. You are doing it. But the shift in perspective is that thinking of the social convention is that you are just the host of this. Tea drinking was around before you were born, and it will be around after you die. So you are just the host of it for a while. You are the vessel through which that convention survives. So that's oversimplified again, like I said, but that's one way of shifting your perspective here. So practices only survive with sufficient meanings, materials, and competencies. So if you want to look that up further, look at Elizabeth Shove and her colleagues' work. And if they interrelate well with other routinized practices, so one of the reasons that tea drinking might survive is that you might bring tea breaks into the everyday routines of kind of your own work, or school or things like that. Or things like gossiping is another practice that people like to engage in, and so they're in harmony, because sometimes you might have a cup of tea and gossip about some things. So these things help sustain the convention of tea drinking. So we try to apply this to physical activity, and we've said that physical activity is the result of the lack of meanings, materials, and competencies, and the lack of harmony with other practices. So you can see how we've applied it in this paper here, and we've looked at it in primary school physical activity. And what we saw was that physical space in the playground and streets matters to this, so you observe all the physically active practices that people do, and you can see how obviously they are reliant, that they wouldn't be sustained if the physical space, the physical matter, the materiality of things wasn't there. Also at the same time, it's the practical know-how of the teachers, parents and children, so individually but also collectively in the context of a game, for example. It's not just individual competence, you need all parties to have competence and understanding, that practical know-how. And importantly, the values and meanings of the activity. So if they're not meaningful to anyone, if they don't do something else on a kind of value level, doesn't kind of sit well with your values, then it won't be sustained either. There's also important interruptions in the routines of the school day. So whether that fits in a physically active practice like walking to school, for example, needs to fit in with the routine of the pupil, of the parent, and how the school is organised as well. So we saw it as a framework to highlight the actual but also the potential interruptions. So what this means, I believe, is that it helps decenter the individual, so avoid placing that blame and shame on individuals. It ensures that physically active practices have what they need to survive and thrive. And we might need to ensure in our interventions that physically active practices are in harmony and not in conflict with other practices. especially superior ones. So parenting and commuting was one of the things that we saw on this active walk to school. The parents wanted to spend time with their child. That was one of their concerns in their everyday life, and commuting, kind of walking to school, was one way of doing that. So they were in harmony, so they kind of worked well together and helped sustain the practice. But maybe for teachers, for example, they had a bunch of different practices that were around meeting targets and different policies that constrain them, and sometimes they were in conflict with, for example, physical education. So then it was a way of looking at those areas of harmony and conflict. So the inequality paradox is a term that is used as well in sociological analysis of physical inactivity. What is it, and how might it help explain physical inactivity? So the argument goes a little bit like this. So not everyone is physically inactive. So if you imagine that 3 out of 10 people are sufficiently physically active and the 7 out of 10 are inactive, if that's the kind of starting point that we're assuming, then that's kind of where we are. But the interventions intended to promote physical activity often operate at the general level, so they're not targeting necessarily the 3 people who are physically so the 7 people who are inactive. They're targeting all 10 if they operate at the general level. So this isn't the case for everything. I'm just saying this is how the argument works. So if these interventions are taken up more readily by already physically active people, so the 3 out of the 10 are the ones who take up that general offer, then physical inactivity has not been solved, and also the outcome is that there's a greater inequality between the already active who become more active and the inactive groups. So that's the kind of paradoxical situation that you are that is talked about in this kind of analysis. So interventions, programs and policies aren't appropriately differentiated. That might be why we are still seeing physical inactivity, and we are leading to lack of success in many programs and interventions. So how have I used this in my own research? I mean, it's an idea that at the time I didn't understand the idea, and I wasn't aware of that, the term and that argument that I've just talked through. But this is a screenshot of a little video put together as part of my PhD, where I got pupils in a school to try and put on a kind of pupil-led intervention about increasing a physically active opportunity in school. And these 2 pupils were the kind of champions, and they came up with rules and what day they were going to do it and where they were going to do it. And it was I thought it was a great kind of bottom up idea. I was really excited about it, and what happened is, somewhat predictably now, is that the people who liked sport and liked physical activity already, it was just another opportunity for them to do it. So that's how I think I can help explain why that idea kind of flopped. But it's also come up in a recent chapter that I've written with Ollie Williams and Cass Gibson, which is forthcoming. And in that chapter, we've said that reducing inequalities requires initial inequities to be accounted for when, for example, distributing funds. We mentioned the primary premium funding, and we cited Meir and Fletcher, who found that the move towards making schools more autonomous in terms of what they can do with the primary premium actually led, according to them, to widening inequality, and ultimately reinforced this kind of postcode lottery whereby the school you attend determines your experience. So what does this mean for policy and practice? If interventions target and meet the needs of disproportionately disadvantaged by inequalities, they do have the potential to enrich the lives of individuals by providing opportunities that are otherwise structurally excluded, excluded from. And we think so that it's a kind of positive there. And if we move towards equity, this might be a good idea as well. So we think about the process in order to achieve equality of outcome. So this means we might invest more for some groups than others, thinking about the structures that reinforce inequalities in the first place. So the sixth idea out of 7 here, I think I'm doing okay for time, is contingency. So what do we mean by contingency? So again, a kind of basic, simplistic explanation might be how we need to disrupt this idea of cause and effect, input and outcome, because they're inappropriate in the open systems of the social world. Now, many would argue that even the kind of natural world is open as well, but I'm thinking of, if there's a sliding scale to it, if you imagine, for example, balls hitting each other on a snooker table, that's a fairly closed system in which things can be the speed in which you hit the ball, the force in which you hit one ball and it hits into another is directly related to how that ball moves, and the angle that you hit the ball at also has a direct impact on the outcome there. It's not entirely closed, but it's a fairly closed example. So in the social world, things don't work the same. So what you put in doesn't always come out in the same way. So consequences are contingent upon multiple contextual characteristics. So if an intervention leads to increased physical activity, which would be great to see, it may be as much because of the context as the intervention itself. And this is probably something that people, I think, are increasingly realising, and I think our methods are beginning to reflect this idea. And we're recognising context as being really important. But there is a tendency within our methods, I'm thinking randomised controlled trials, for example, as being a kind of primary idea, which is based on a much more closed system view of how the world works, how cause and effect works. And if it's borrowed from medicine, we're maybe thinking of this intervention as the pill, the input. We're not taking enough account of how the context, the school context, the spatial context, the cultural context, how that might impact. So the tendency then, if it does work, is to try and take that intervention and use it elsewhere. But that's obviously a huge problem. So I think this is the case of physical activity programs, as much as is the case for medicine, actually, and we're starting to see a move towards this even in medicine. So we know, for example, it seems obvious once we say it, that chemotherapy for treating cancer doesn't work for everyone, and we don't actually know whether it's going to work for everyone. All we know is that on average it works better than doing nothing when you're obviously treating certain types of cancer. And lots of medical decision making is involved here, but the idea is that it's going to work on average more than not doing it. But at an individual level, we still don't know. So it's the same as parenting. So a parenting style might have kind of worked in terms of sleep or the behaviours that you're hoping to see and the characteristics you're hoping to give to your child. They might work for one child, but they might be totally different for another. And if you've ever watched a comedy routine where the comedian, a joke totally flops, you'll see this as well. So the same joke is going to fall totally differently in different contexts. So why I think this might explain physical inactivity is that we haven't found the intervention that can be scaled up for entire populations, perhaps because what works isn't the right type of question. We shouldn't be asking the kind of what works question. So I haven't really used this in my research yet. I've applied for funding for a project where this was integral, but it wasn't funded, so I haven't really had a chance to explore this fully. But it is a feature of my interest in methodology, so contingency and context and causation does come up in these papers, but much better than my papers would be, I think, this book here, which came out a couple of years ago, which I would increasingly, I'm comfortable calling myself a realist or a critical realist, and I would certainly be supportive of the ideas that are in the methods that are proposed in this book here. So what this might mean, I think it has huge implications for generalizability and applicability. So even if we do figure it out, and if the JUMP program, comes up with some fantastic ideas, I think there's a huge danger then if other cities might want to take the ideas. We need to be really careful about what it was about that context that made it work. Local expertise and information on the ground is absolutely crucial. I think academics and scientists maybe coming up with ideas in offices is rightfully being a kind of forgotten idea. And history and time is also something interesting as well, which is not talked about hugely. When we talk about context, we tend to think of kind of changing in different locations. But we need to remember that history and time is part of the context too. So an intervention might work for a certain period of time, but then it might have run out of steam, and what might have worked in that place 5 years ago may not work now, and the same intervention each year might not be have the same success. Okay, and the final idea here I'm going to talk about is transformative change. So the image there is about kind of protest movements, because I think there's an increasing move towards understanding how broader ideas of social change happen. And in sociology, I think this is really at the heart of it. So the relationship between individuals and society is one of the things that people have been grappling with for a long time, and there's not a full kind of agreement on it. We call it the structure and agency debate. And I think in sociology we're very good, and even more broadly outside of sociology, we're very good at explaining reproduction. So stereotypes is a really obvious one. So they might reproduce inactivity for girls. So if you might socialize girls into inactivity, or stereotypes also exist for older adults who maybe not seen and not see themselves as their stereotypical daily life of an older adult might not be to be physically active. So kind of there's a stereotype around there which might reproduce the idea of physical inactivity being more appropriate. So, but also this relates to planning policies that prioritize cars over pedestrians, and this prevents urban mobility. So this is reproduction. So we're good at explaining these things, but the argument here, and why I'm interested in it, is I think we need to talk more, think more, theorize more about how change actually occurs. So I think psychologists and behavioral scientists have been doing this. This is at the heart of what this does. It's about changing behaviors. It's about doing things differently. How do different things lead to different actions being done in the future by people? But obviously they can only go so far, as we know from the social ecological model. So the explanation here is that high levels of physical inactivity will continue unless we achieve transformative change in the cultural and structural level. So they need to go beyond the individual behaviour. And like I said, sociologists are quite good at talking about why things stay the same, but we need to get better at talking about why things change so we can understand it. So we have a paper with Ian Lindsay here, which has been presented at a conference, but is currently in review. What we're arguing here is we're looking at social change in the context of support for development, and to boil it down, again, we're oversimplifying this, but we believe that change occurs through individual reflection. It is about individuals reflecting, but they're reflecting on the conditions that they're in. And if they choose not to reproduce those conditions, then you might see some change occurring. And this transforms the conditions for other people. So different people, though, crucially, have greater and lesser power to transform conditions. So change will always come. It needs to come through agency, people's individual choices, but everyday people's lives, they've only got so much amount of agency to change and transform the conditions around them, and you have to go to more powerful people and to understand how they can reflect to bring about change to broader structures and cultures. So what this might mean is it's being supportive of a whole systems approach, and the creating active schools framework. This is embedded in the whole idea. So we're already seeing this being appreciated as being important. Encouraging interaction and reflection on the conditions, I think, is important. People need to have a greater awareness of these conditions that they're in, because reflecting on them is and interacting with them, playing around with what you should do, what you shouldn't do, playing around with stereotypes, learning about how change can occur kind of politically, but culturally as well, educating people. And we're in the midst of a kind of awakening for many people about racist behaviours and many other problematic social justice issues. So we'll be very aware of this kind of interaction that we have at the moment, and these moments of reflection that we have as individuals within this space. But we need to engage people at all levels of the system. We need to appreciate that everyone is acting in conditions not of their choosing. So even if you are a politician in a more powerful position, you have conditions around you that guide the projects and concerns and motivations that you have. And that will constrain the reflections and decisions you make. So we can only really think of what are my options here, and that's an important kind of phrase that I've got in my head when I'm thinking through this. And we need to appreciate that change takes time as well. So there were my 7 ideas. A huge thank you for inviting me again. I hope some of them resonated with people. Of course, please don't hesitate to get in touch for further reading. I can send any of those papers over, and I'm really keen on collaborations as well. And if you think there's anything that I might be interested in and I can help work towards, that would be, of course, part of my role here as a lecturer, engaging in research and engaging with practical initiatives as well. But if I could, it would be great to open this up for questions, but also I'd like to ask myself if any of this resonates with you, and how does it resonate, and whether you find this useful. Because if it isn't relevant, and if it's all old hat and you knew this stuff anyway, then it would be useful feedback so I can stop wasting my time and maybe change direction a little bit. So I'd love to hear from you as well.